sure I have this right. George and Ben Cassutto.
That's pretty good.
Very good.
Spell Cassutto for me?
Cassutto.
T-T.
Double
Yes.
T.
That's
Double
a good
T.
thing you told me that, 'cause I don't think I
Yes,
would
there's
do it.
even a little funny story with that, but I don't.
If you have one T, it refers to the Dutch side.
Yeah, the Dutch side on
Right.
the other side of the ocean is one.
Right.
That
Oh,
happened a
okay.
little while ago.
Oh, that's
We
a good
distinguished
thing.
ourselves by keeping the two. That was a little.
And there's also he's now deceased, but there was a George Cassutto, so you have to do it right. So, yeah. My uncle.
To start off with, we're here to talk about your parents' experience during the war. Can you tell me a little bit, though, about your folks? Where they were born, where they grew up?
You want to take it, Ben? Ben's our unofficial biographer right now. So.
Dad was born in Probolinggo, Indonesia. Indonesia. Why Indonesia? Because at the time it was a colony of the Netherlands called the Dutch East Indies. And my grandfather was a professor of law, and he was sent by the Dutch government to Indonesia, which then a colony, to teach law to the Indonesians, to the colonials. So my father was born while they were there. 1919, December 1st. My mother, on the other hand, was born in Amsterdam, which is the capital of Holland or the Netherlands, in, I guess, April. What's Mom's birthday?
23rd.
April 23rd, I know.
31.
1931. So she lived in the Jewish section of Amsterdam, grew up there, little Jewish girl.
And what are their names?
Well, my mom's name was Elisabeth. To her friends, Elly, E-L-L-Y. Her maiden name was Rodriguez, Elisabeth Rodriguez. And my dad, of course, was Ernest Henricus Cassutto. Another family tradition is that we are all middle named Henricus.
Latinized
version of Henry.
Even my son. So, hey, we survived it. We turned out relatively normal, so we passed that tradition on.
Right.
Do you know much about their experience growing up with their, was there a Jewish community that they were active in their hometowns?
For my dad, I don't know if you want to jump in for any of this, but a lot of this is just so familiar to me. For my dad, no. My dad, you have to understand, my dad and my grandparents were in the Dutch East Indies or Indonesia, jungles. I guess the major religion is Hinduism, is it?
I think it's Buddhism.
Buddhism, or Buddhism, right. No, it's, Buddhism or Hinduism, one of those two. As my dad loved to put it, he wasn't even circumcised because it would have taken 8 days for a rabbi, for a moil to circumcise my father when he was born would have taken 8 days by boat. So my grandfather didn't even really bother.
So they were non-practicing Jews.
Well,
actually, just a correction. I think the major religion in Indonesia is Muslim.
Muslim,
right?
Of course, Muslim.
With a Buddhist minority.
With a Buddhist minority.
Right.
So
Christianity certainly small.
Buddhism,
Judaism.
Very little Christianity at that point. Very little Judaism at that point. So, no. And my grandfather actually became what was called a Freemason, if you know what that is, Masonry. Now for my mom, what's so interesting about this story is for my mom, completely different situation. Amsterdam, she was born in Amsterdam in the southern portion, which still today, because my wife and I just went back there, that's still the Jewish community even to this day, the southern portion of Amsterdam. And
what survived the Holocaust?
Well, yeah, that survived the Holocaust, right. Well, they're back up to Holland's back up to 10%, which is interesting because that's what they were before the Holocaust. So they've come back up. So she was born, in a Jewish community, went to the synagogue every Saturday, celebrated all the holidays, that kind of thing.
Were they Orthodox then?
I wouldn't say that.
No.
I would say they're more in the conservative, what could be seen as conservative community. So certainly not, I don't even know if Reformed existed at that time, if the extremely liberal viewpoint, but not in the Hasidim area either, you know. So certainly fervent and believing, practicing, but not on the Orthodox side, I would say.
Right.
Yeah.
So her
You hit it right in the
Jewishness
head.
and her family was very important to her.
Yes. They were
There-
conscious of their
But
Jewishness.
I don't know all the details. It would be wonderful if some of these elderly people in my family were here. But I know that, for instance, on my mother's side, there might have been a rabbi or a moil or something. I know on my father's side, even though he wasn't practicing, who would that be? Caroline's father. So that would be his grandfather was the head of the Jewish community in The Hague back in Holland. So, you know, you had these ties from the parents and the grandparents from their younger days. Like we were in Holland in 1974. I'm just going to interject. I don't know if you remember this. We were in Holland in 1974 touring the Jewish Historical Museum in Amsterdam. And my uncle, who's now deceased, my Uncle George, we're walking along, and he didn't even know this. We're walking along, and there's this picture of the Hadassah from the synagogue in Amsterdam. You can understand Holland's a very small country, so my grandmother probably went to synagogue in Amsterdam for the High Holy Days, even though she lived in The Hague, because it's so close. And my uncle's looking at the picture, and he goes, "That's Mom!" And it was a picture of like the 1914 Hadassah. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I think it's earlier than that. I think it's
Or
1907 or
06,
something.
yeah.
Man.
That's Mom. And he didn't even know she was up there. And so, you know, they were practicing Jews in their younger days, but as you get busy and then they go to Indonesia, how much you really can't, you know, it's there, but you're not really doing any of it. That's my father's side, not my mother's side.
Another interesting element of my family, actually I know during the 1950s, which would be after World War II, our great uncle, and Umberto Cassutto, is known as one of the foremost scholars in Israel on the Old Testament. So, but obviously he had to be developing his scholarly, career just prior to the war and of course after the war. But during 1950s he published a number of papers regarding the Exodus. And so that name Umberto Cassutto is very well known in Israel
sure.
in scholarly circles.
Yep.
So just happen to know that. And it's really strange because when I was in undergrad, I had to take Old Testament, and it was really wild to see his name in my textbook. So it was really cool.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, apart from, well, not exactly apart from your parents' story, but as children of survivors, do you think there's anything different in your upbringing than from, other kids with parents, like Gentile families who had nothing to do with the war? What do you think was different in your upbringing?
I'd like to jump in on that one because my excuse me, my parents were quite vocal about their experiences because my father was a minister to the Jews and later on a Presbyterian minister, and my mother was a teacher of foreign languages, and this gave them many opportunities. Of course, my mother also spoke for my father in a number of different occasions as a minister's wife. So it was unusual as survivors for them to be vocal about it because generally survivors are internalize much of their trauma and they don't share it unless they make it a point to be on the offensive to prevent another Holocaust and involved in prejudice reduction efforts. Generally, they're quiet about it, and so that's not just being different about other kids. That's being different about other survivors. For my parents. So we grew up hearing the story of the Holocaust, and this gave us a very intense awareness of history and of their experiences, and certainly of how the Lord helped them through it. So we became spiritually aware, I think, at a much more younger age than most kids would, even kids who would be in a religious setting, say church or synagogue or whatever. Cognitively, they wouldn't really have a conscious awareness of their own spirituality until maybe 13, when they're, hitting puberty, and the age of cognition allows that. But I think we heard it at a much earlier age, so we became much more aware and conscious of it. Now, it didn't mean we went around talking about it, but certainly I think we were aware. In fact, I remember as an 11, 12-year-old being interested in World War II and reading historical documents on World War II because that's what I had heard almost every Sunday. I had heard the story, so it heightened my awareness of history, and that's how I became a social studies teacher. That's what led to an interest in history in general. So I think from my personal perspective, I don't know certainly
Same. I agree with
Ben
you
has
completely.
some
I was just gonna s-
parallel to that.
Well, I was just going to say, we contrasted to most other families probably that survived the Holocaust, like George said, unless they took a stand, to, never again, never again, you probably didn't hear a whole lot.
And during the
Where-
60s, I don't think there were that many people out there, preaching
Right.
the word against Nazism, against neo-Nazism, against prejudice. It was too soon. It was
Right.
still only 15 years after the end of the war. So I think there had to be somewhat of a healing for survivors before they could get out there. Now, of course, you have your Simon Wiesenthals and
Schindler's
your
List,
and
and
your
Shoah
Elie Wiesel,
Foundation,
who wrote the book Night and who helped found the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. But think about when that was founded. That was 1993. That took a while for it to coalesce in the consciousness of Americans as survivors integrated in their society. So I think my parents were a little bit ahead of their time.
Yeah, they were.
Yeah,
We were hearing it from a very young age. We were always exposed to, what they went through, what happened in Europe in general, who Hitler was, that kind of thing. We heard it from a very early age.
Now, hearing it, those atrocities at that age, of course, this would depend also on how your parents presented it, but what did you think of Christians?
Well, we were Christians.
Yeah, we were Christians.
Did you think Hitler was a Christian?
Now you're talking about little kids here during the 60s. So I don't know if we could even accurately envision who or what Hitler was. Of course, I think, I see my own kids grow up, and as I tell them the story, they can envision. They see pictures of Hitler generally being a bad man. He's the bad
He's the
man.
bad
He's the
guy.
baddest
Right,
guy there is.
right.
And when I teach about Hitler, I really try to de-emphasize the personal aspect because it's important to understand that all of German society had complicity in the Holocaust. And while Hitler certainly was a catalyst, anti-Semitism existed in Germany long before Hitler came around.
That's
He
right.
used the basis
Right.
of those sentiments to
What is
gain
it?
power.
The Protocols of the Elders of Zion.
Yeah,
is
that was
what
that was as early as the late 1800s. So that was a forged document that was used to increase hatred of Jews in Germany and in Europe. But anyway, the point is, so I didn't really hear too much about Hitler per se. I think maybe I remember hearing Mom how she felt about Hitler, especially because she lost her parents in the war. So that was, I think that's the closest to the focal point. And another interesting point I think that we heard as we grew up was the need to forgive, the need to forgive, and even to forgive Hitler. And I've studied the phenomenon of Hitler since then and try to get a different perspective on it and not personalize that aspect of the Holocaust. While without de-emphasizing its importance, there are many explanations for why Hitler did what he did. And I don't think we really need to go into those. We'll say those for another time. But the point that I'm trying to say is, as Christians, we had to understand that we had to forgive the Germans and forgive even the worst Nazis. And my father had to forgive his torturers. He did that on their deathbed. He went to their deathbed. It's described in his book, how he sat down with his torturer and said, "I forgive you." Now that's a monumental overcoming of personal feeling for Christ and a witness. And also another aspect of that is how my mother ended up teaching English to German people. She said she would never step foot in Germany.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And at the end of her life, she went to Germany to teach. And so she had to overcome that. And on her deathbed, she died of cancer in 1984. When she was in her decline, she had to come to grips with the decision to forgive the Germans and the Nazis. And I remember, hearing about that conversation between her and our sister Marilyn, saying, am I right with God? She was saying, am I right with God? Am I okay? Am I ready to go? And Marilyn said, have you forgiven the Nazis? And she said, yes. And again, that's a very challenging thing. And you really have to understand and live the Christ-like life and use him as your paradigm for living in order to overcome that level of hatred. And so she harbored a very strong hatred for German people after the war, even though she professed to believe in Christ. But that was
There's always a
but she
conflict
did that.
there.
Yeah, but in the end,
For some reason, though, it was easier for my father than it was for my mother. I don't know.
well, he didn't lose his parents.
Right. But my father endured more suffering himself than my mother did, if you look at it comparatively speaking. But one thing I want to also interject about your question, your original question was about, repeat your question again?
Christians.
About what did
How
you,
they were perceived,
okay.
yeah.
Okay, well, the thing about Christians is, of course, we grew up, you know, living as Christians. We were called Hebrew Christians back then. But one of the things that was emphasized from my parents very strongly, I think from my mom also, because she, well, both of them, is that who are true Christians? A lot of people can say they're Christians. You can say you're a Christian. You can say that you go to church, okay? But the true Christians were the ones who would lay down their life for their brother. The true Christians, okay? Hitler might have professed to be a Christian.
Yeah, no, actually he didn't. He was
well,
he was
I guess-
anti-Christian.
I guess
He-
what I'm saying is there are Nazis who may have professed to being Christians. You see, I don't know, I watched one thing on the Holocaust or Nazi Germany where you saw little Nazi children. I prefer to use the word Nazi because not all Germans are, I don't want to equate Germans and Nazis. So during that time you see these children celebrating, singing Christmas carols, they're lighting candles at Christmas time, they're, you know, that kind of thing. But then they're going out the next day and rounding up Jews and sending them to the gas chambers, okay? It's that you can profess to be a Christian, okay? But how do you treat your brother, okay? The true Christians were the ones who helped Jewish people. The Dutch people who got together and said, we don't care what's going to happen to us. Literally, to my father, to my mother, we don't care what's going to happen to us.
The Righteous Gentiles, as
Yes,
they're
the
known
Righteous
in the
Gentiles.
Holocaust community, Righteous Gentiles. But also, when you study the Holocaust, you run into names like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a German minister who spoke out early on
Right,
against
yes.
Hitler's ideologies, and so of course he ended up dying in concentration camp. Martin Niemöller, who was his famous quote about when they came for the Jews, and they came for the trade unionists, they came to communists, and no one was left to speak for me when they came for me. Now he survived, but nevertheless he spent time in concentration camp because he was willing to stand up against the powers that were at that time
Or
and speak their mind.
The Ten Bohms.
Yeah,
Corrie ten Boom, his father. My wife and I went to Holland last year.
Of course, Corrie ten Boom wasn't Jewish. She was a Christian,
That's
right?
what I'm saying.
Right.
She was a Christian.
Right.
But her family, even before the Holocaust, stood up for the Jewish people, loved the Jewish people. Okay, so my mother always used to quote the scripture from Matthew. I'm not really exactly sure which chapter, but it's the part where Jesus or Yeshua is talking about, how you treated my brethren. I was naked and you clothed me. I was in prison and you visited me. Okay.
Hungry, you fed
hungry
me.
and you fed me. We were always taught that when Jesus or Yeshua was saying that, when he says my brethren, well, Jesus is Jewish. He's a Jew. So when he's talking about his brothers, this is my brother. Okay, he's Jewish, my brethren. That's what that means. How you treat my brethren.
Yeah, but he also said, anyone who does this to the least of my brethren. Which means when you see a homeless person, you help them out. When you see somebody in trouble, you lend a hand. That is the least of my brethren.
But the impression I always got, though, and maybe this is just an impression for me that you didn't get, is that when he said my brethren, when we were saying that the Christians in Holland meant that to mean these Jewish people, because Jesus was a Jew, okay, they are his brethren.
Right. So we have to extend
that to the Jewish people. And they're being persecuted right now. Yeah. And because Jesus said that, this little 12-year-old girl shows up at Grietje Bogarts' door, and they're asking her to take this little Jewish girl in.
He's referring to my mom.
To my mom, yes, to my mom, who the question did come. It's right in my father's book. The question came from my grandfather. why in the world are you I mean, you realize that by taking in this 12-year-old Jewish girl, okay, you may be killed. You may risk your life. Why are you doing that? What makes you want to risk your life? Okay.
But that effort was replicated all over Europe. I mean, there are documented stories
Right.
of that. Yeah.
So, but that's what I take away from when you talk about Christians. That's my big thing is go by what they did, not by what they said. Even today, go by what they do. They can say they're a Christian, but if they don't realize that Jesus was Jewish and they're going to treat Jews a certain way, in a negative way, and say they're Christian, that's kind of antithetical.
Let me now have you guys talk a little bit about your parents' experience. Tell me, what your dad's experience during the war was. Kind of like outline what happened. At the onset.
Do we have 5 hours now?
But we're going to have to
As
edit it.
brief-
Yeah.
Yeah.
there's editing.
No,
but,
I'm
brevity is
kidding.
good, but we do want the story. Tell us basically what happened to them and how they survived.
You want to take one? I'll take one. Yeah.
Okay, why don't you take one?
I'll take
Okay.
Mom, and you take
Okay.
Dad.
Okay,
Okay.
but we'll both have a chance to
interchange, sure.
interject.
Yeah.
Well, my father, he spent the first, 12 years, 14 years of his life in
Yeah,
Indonesia.
14,
14 years of his life in Indonesia and the Dutch East Indies. So,
Came back to Holland in 34. Came back to Holland in 34.
okay, we'll help each other. Came back to Holland in 34 when my grandfather's time in Indonesia was over. And so from 34 on, you heard of things going on in Germany, because Hitler
Took power in 33.
took power in 33. So it was one country away. You heard all that. And the thing is, the Dutch people from 33 on, because they were neutral, the country of the Netherlands was neutral in World War I. They were neutral. They weren't involved at all. The common theory or the common thing sitting in the pub was, that'll never happen here. We're going to be neutral again. No one would ever think of invading, the Netherlands, that kind of thing. I think that was the impression I got, was that in the earlier years was a pervading thought. Oh, this could never happen here. We were neutral in World War I. We're just a tiny little country. Who's going to ever care about us? But the impression I got from a lot of the research I did about Hitler and the Nazis is that they cared a whole lot about Holland, because that was the Low Countries. Those were the people who they wanted to bring back into Germany, Holland.
Fellow Germanic
People. Okay, so my father was there, and he went to what you call Latin school and high school, and he started trying to rebuild his life in Holland. And Holland is very different than Indonesia. It's cold, it's snowy in the wintertime, it's flat, it's right on the water, it's right on the North Sea. The impression I got from my father in the book is he hated it.
You'll need to really telescope this down.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Well.
'cause we're-
Okay. So then, but still, of course, as I said before, they weren't really practicing Jews all that much, even when they got back to Holland. So then, in 1940, Hitler did invade Holland, and when he did invade, the impression the Jews got even then, the whole country got, is that everything was going to pretty much remain the same. They're going to be under Nazi rule, but nothing's going to really change. That's what was told to them when they invaded, but of course that was a big lie. Okay. So over the span of time, the first year and a half, things did start changing. They got forms in November of 1940 that they had to fill out, saying how many Jewish grandparents they had. And that was kind of disguised as kind of just a registration form. No one really thought anything about it. My grandparents filled it out. Of course, everybody was Jewish, 4 Jewish grandparents. You send that in. Things start coming in the works, like little segregation laws that you've probably all heard about from the Holocaust.
Application of the Nuremberg laws
Nuremberg
in Germany
laws,
to occupied
territories. But then other laws like curfew laws, no Jews in theaters. Segregation laws, shops. You could only shop in a Jewish shop from this time to this time.
And then the banning of the holding of certain positions.
Right.
Like
well, that's what happened to my
professor
grandfather,
and
which was that he was expelled from the university because he was Jewish, and he was a professor there, so that was kind of an indignation for him. And then quickly going through the story, my grandfather did get arrested by the Green Police and then was set free. So he was arrested in like 41, kept in prison for a while, and then set free.
Did my grandmother go down to the
Grandma
Gestapo and
went
demand
down
his release?
to the Green Police, demanding his release. How can you hold someone like this in prison?
And it worked.
And it worked. She got him released. And after that, they knew that things weren't going to be all hunky-dory with this new regime. So then, in 1942, trying to capsize all this, then you have, starting in April of 1942, so now you have from 40 to 42, there was kind of this pervasion of things happening, the Nuremberg laws, the segregation and all that, culminating in the wearing of the Jewish star. So in May 1942, then the Nazis said everyone in Holland who's filled out these forms who we consider Jewish must wear a star on their lapel of all their clothing that has Jewish mocking letters, Jew, on it, to distinguish them. And then also, of course, much of that was tied to segregating a lot of Jews into Amsterdam, which was funny that my parents and my father didn't have to do that. For some reason, they were left in The Hague. I'll never understand that part, because what they were really trying to do was get everybody into Amsterdam so they could deport them from Amsterdam. But my father, in July of 1942, got his letter to show up in Amsterdam to go for what they called labor service in Germany. He got that letter on July 12th, 1942, and he was scared to death. And even before that, he had become, friends with some Christians and had become a very young, what we'd call believer or Christian himself. But before he got at the same time he was going through all this, he became a Christian.
So he was learning about.
Yes.
Learning about Christ.
But he was going to church with his Christian friends and had, taken a profession of faith. He was what we call in Christian circles a baby believer, baby Christian. But his friends in those Christian circles said, look, you don't have to submit to this. These were the Dutch Christians I'm talking about. You don't have to submit to this. There are people who will help hide you, so you don't have to go. There's no, and he was engaged to another Jewish woman, Hetty Winkel. So they, in the beginning, did that together. They tried to hide together, which is very difficult. Taking on one Jewish and hiding is bad enough, but taking two who are of the same age, so they did that for about 6 weeks. And after about 6 weeks, they had to split up, Hetty and my father. So then it just became a matter of finding hiding places. Every couple of months, there's 44 total hiding places. But in the book that my father wrote, he didn't mention all 44. So he mentioned a few of them: Salvation Army soldier, an Indonesian woman who was a Christian, a high school teacher who hid them, various different ones, and he had to go from town to town. He'd stay at an address. He'd get news from the underground that his address had gotten what they call hot. Your address is getting hot. That means the Green Police are on your tail. You better move. Okay? And he did that from 1942 until September of 1944, correct? Mm-hmm. Yep. Or maybe August, September of 1944. When he was ironically, he was in hiding with a pharmacist in a Dutch town called Leiden, and his brother, or my uncle, happened to be staying there at the same time because their address in The Hague was getting hot. So by this time, my grandparents and my uncle, they were also in hiding, okay? And everybody was coming to visit the pharmacy. My grandmother needed dental work, okay? And you couldn't get dental work done, once again, by anybody. You had to go to someone in the underground who would do dental work on Jewish people, because that would be risking their profession and their lives too. So they found a dentist in Leiden. They said, let's go what you call above water. Underwater means hiding. Above water means you come up to risk
like
for
above
something.
ground, yeah.
Above ground. Yeah. And let's risk, she had to go to the dentist, but in the same town was Ernest and George, their two sons. So let's combine that with a visit to Ernest and George. So when my father got caught, which he did, he got caught in late August of 1944, they were all together. It was George, who was younger by about what? How old was 9 years?
Yeah.
My father, my grandmother, and my grandfather were all in the same place. They were having what little lunch you could have back then. Ground potatoes, potato bread or whatever, cherries for coffee, whatever you could have back then. The Green Police showed up, and my grandmother and my uncle immediately hid in a closet, like a little broom closet that they never thought to search. They never, praise God, they never really even checked it out. Okay, my father ran up to the third floor. My grandfather, in Holland, you had to have stamps to listen to the radio. You bought stamps, and you put them near your radio, and you could only listen to German or Nazi radio. And even to do that, you had to put stamps on the wall to pay for it. As the Nazis came in, he had his hat and coat. You always had your hat and coat near you. He noticed the stamps on the wall. He was kind of standing near there and said, and he said in a very loud voice while they were coming in, he said, "I see you've paid your radio tax. I'm just here to check it. Thank you very much." Put his hat and coat on and left. And then met up with them later on. Okay? But the person who got caught was my father, because he just ran up to the third floor and was hiding behind a curtain, like, behind a window, had 2 revolvers stuck in his side. They pulled the curtain back, saw him, and hauled him away. Then from September of 1944, he was taken to the prison in Rotterdam, and he was imprisoned there for 9 months.
Now, this is not to be confused with the concentration camp.
Right, he was in a prison. He wasn't in any kind of...
It's a big building, so
Right.
it's and it's in an urban center. It's not in
Right.
in a concentration camp out in the middle of the woods
Right,
somewhere,
right.
but certainly stark conditions, which
Right.
I'm sure
Little
you'll
cell. In 1974, when we were 14, we got a chance to see the cell. Little cell, maybe about, from here to there, with a little toilet, a little light bulb, excuse me, and he was thrown in there, and
maybe 4 by 7 feet.
Yeah, 4 by 7 feet.
Just a bench, a light bulb, and a toilet.
Right. And there was a Jewish star put on his door, because there was a Jewish star put on his door to signify that he was Jewish, because there were other Gentiles who were in the prison.
Criminals, insane.
But other people who had helped, collaborate with the
Jews.
underground.
Right.
There was one gentleman there who helped pilots, American pilots, who had fallen, who were in Holland. So there were other people who were Gentile in the prison, enemies of the Nazi regime. But there were also Jews there, like my father, who were there to get deported. So they would denote that by putting, of course, the Jewish star on their door. Well, soon after my father got there, which was in probably late September, he was there one night and heard a lot of clanging, a lot of commotion, doors opening, slamming shut, round up kind of thing. And he was sitting inside his cell going, "What's going on?" And before that, they were allowed to come up for a half an hour for water, they'd call it coming up for water or air, whatever you want to call it, coming out of their cell. And that had stopped for a while, and then after a while, he was allowed to come up again, okay, and notice that he was the only Jewish person left. That there were 10 other Gentiles, other people who weren't Jewish, and out of the whole prison, there was only 11 people there, and it was a huge place, but he was the only Jew.
Hence the name
the last Jew of Rotterdam. Okay.
And now, how was it that he was left?
Oh, you're helping me here.
How is it?
He was left because when he got there, he was informed as he was getting there that one of the guards there, who's the one who put him in the cell in the beginning, was of the Dutch underground, okay, who was posing as a Nazi sympathizer, which is called an NSBer, that's called someone of the Dutch Nazi Party, who was a spy. So you can look at him as a spy, kind of like I Spy.
Mole. Or a mole.
Yeah. And so he knew that, but he didn't know what was going on outside his cell. He couldn't have. He was inside the cell. Found out after the war that the guard took the Jewish star off of his door. Okay? So the Nazis are very
Rule-oriented.
yeah, they only know, I mean, they only know what they see. You know, the people who were, for some reason, I don't know if that's a thing about, I don't know. But, you know, no Jewish star on the door, no Jewish star on the
Yeah,
door.
they're following orders.
Yeah,
You know.
no Jewish star on the door, not going to take them. Just take anybody who's got a Jewish star on the door. Not realizing Cassutto, who's inside, he's Jewish. Who cares about Jewish star on the door? If he's Jewish, take him. But they didn't go that far, you know. So he was left. And then historically, after September, there were no more deportations because of something called the Battle of Arnhem, where the Americans did try, in a vain attempt to stop the war by trying to invade Germany from a town in Holland called Arnhem. Okay, now they didn't succeed. Okay,
It's depicted in the movie A Bridge Too Far.
A Bridge Too Far. If you've ever heard of Cornelius Ryan and A Bridge
yeah,
Too Far, great book,
Cornelius
great movie.
Ryan, right.
It explains the whole story
Robert Redford.
of the Battle of Arnhem. But the thing that happened, and this is how God uses even things like war, okay, to help people, okay, is that blew up the train, the bridges, the train bridges from Holland into where the gas chambers were, Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen. They couldn't do it anymore for the last 9 months. Even if they wanted to, they couldn't get my father out because there was no train to get him out. So he had to stay in the prison. So from September of 44 until the liberation, he was in the prison.
May 45.
Yes, May 45. But there was a slave labor camp about 5 miles away, an actual, not really a concentration camp, once again, but a camp for the Nazis where they were fed and had their barracks and all that. And my father and the other 10 in the prison had to work at this slave labor camp. So for 9 months, he was shuttled back and forth with 10 other people to the slave labor camp. Bitter cold, no food, no water in the prison. The water was getting very scarce. No bathing, no showers, no nothing. No shoes. He had to walk bare feet in the cold, 5 miles back and forth, you know, working KP duty, peeling potatoes, whatever they had him do. So he did that from September and, you know, literally starving to death. If my father were here, he'd say, sugar beets,
And tulip bulbs.
tulip bulbs. Tulips are the Dutch
Flower.
staple. Taking the bulb and frying it in candle grease, and that's what you ate. Really wrecks your intestines. So
And he suffered after that.
yeah, he did. He suffered with medical problems after that from that, definitely. So now we're getting to the very end. Now it's the very end of the war. It's like May 2nd or May 1st. Liberation of Holland was on May 5th,
5th,
right?
yeah.
So on May 1st, there's rumors you had to see and hear that it's really the Canadians who liberated most of Holland. Canadians, but the Canadians are coming, the Americans are coming, we're finally going to get liberated. And then along with that, what are they going to do to the 11 of us? Okay? Well, we're going to get shot. We're going to get, because the Nazis didn't want any witnesses to their crimes. So they would line the people up before they were invaded and just do a firing squad and get rid of all the documents, try to get rid of documents, am I right? Get rid of evidence, get rid of people who could testify, this is what they did to me for 9 months. So now my father's fearing for his life again about this firing squad, which is going to happen in the next couple of days. In comes the Dutch Underground Guard again. Now the Dutch Underground Guard has been the one taking them to the slave labor camp for the 9 months, okay? So he's been trying to take them off the way and get some food for them on the way. He's been keeping them safe and making sure the other Nazis don't, you know, beat anybody or do anything like that. He hears of the firing squad plans before the people in the prison. The Dutch Underground was real good at intercepting information. So he knows the firing squad's going to happen before anybody in the prison who's in charge knows, okay? And devises a plan, goes to the commandant of the prison, Herr Bartels, and says, my prisoners have not had a bath in 2 weeks, 3 weeks. They literally have not had a bath. They need to get a bath. They need to go down into the city because there's no water here in the prison. They need to go into the city to get a bath. Okay? And I'm sure it took a lot of convincing because, the guy can see the handwriting on the wall. If you want my opinion, my father, this was never put anywhere, but I know from my mother that the Nazis in general were very afraid of diseases. The thing about if they would hide Jews by putting a sign on the door that says TB, no Nazi. If you had a sign on the door that said quarantine TB, no Nazi would ever go in there. They take the sign, put it on the other door. Now that one's quarantined. There's 5 Jews in there. Put it on the next door. Now that one's quarantined. No Nazi would ever go into anything that says quarantine. Okay, so I'm sure he said to the commandant of the prison, look, they're making your food. They haven't had a bath in 3 weeks and they're making your food? Are you sure you want them making your food? Oh, yeah, let them, you're right. Let them
Clean them up.
Clean them up. So he wrote out passes from the commandant. You couldn't get out without a pass from the commandant. So he wrote out passes for everybody, my father included, to go get a bath. And this was like maybe 2 days before the liberation. Hey, they didn't go get a bath. Well, they got a bath later on probably, but they went to the Dutch underground hideout. They didn't go, and by that time, the Nazis probably figured it out and said, oh, I can't believe it. They're gone. The prisoners are gone. They never came back.
So escape.
So he escaped the firing squads.
Oh, that is an amazing story. Can I ask her briefly?
Mhm.
What happened to the rest of his family?
Oh, they successfully hit out. You have to understand, the Nazis were concerned with people from ages 16 to 40. Okay? My grandparents were too old. My uncle was too young. 12 years old? They didn't care about a 12-year-old. Well, they did, but they hid out successfully. And you could, in the big scheme of things, you can see the person who got caught was the one who was of the age that could be used for work, my father, 23, 24. Okay?
Well, when you say they weren't interested, they were
Of course
interested
they
in
were
killing
interested,
them.
right? Killing them, but not. In other words,
Not
not
using
using them for
right,
work.
Right, and
okay?
for the war effort.
So if you could somehow evade them, go into the countryside. Okay, it's one thing that's I've never understood this about Otto Frank, and maybe it's because he wasn't Dutch, he was German. Okay, if he just would have taken those children, his children, instead of keeping them in Amsterdam, okay, where they were being rounded up every day, if he just would have taken them to the Dutch countryside, Hazerswoude, Gelderland, somewhere where there were no Nazis running around every day, okay, his kids would have probably made it too. But he didn't. He kept them in Amsterdam. Amsterdam, if you stayed in Amsterdam, you were sitting, now we're getting, hey, good, now into Mom's, if you were in
it's a segue.
Amsterdam, you were a sitting duck. You
Yeah,
were
but
a
he
sitting
probably
duck.
wanted to have control. You know,
Sure,
we're talking
sure.
about Otto Frank, the father of Anne Frank, and thinking comparatively, why did Anne Frank get captured as opposed to my mother? And the answer is, according to what Ben is saying, is that he hid them in an urban center where there was a greater chance for them to be found because of the concentration of troops in Amsterdam.
Right.
But I don't know. I haven't ever studied that.
But just to answer your question, my grandparents and my uncle did hide in the countryside. They weren't in the Amsterdam. They weren't in The Hague. They were in a little town called Nieuw-Vennep, which was, I've been back there. It's so small you could throw a stone across it.
You've been through it. You don't even know you've been through it.
You don't even, it's like in Fiddler,
Yeah.
People who pass through Anatevka don't even know they've been here.
there, yeah.
Well, people who pass through Nieuw-Vennep, they certainly don't know they've been there either. So if you hide in a town like that,
In the countryside, I think it was easier to take on the life of a non-Jew and pose as a member of the community,
right.
with the knowledge of the people who you're kind of taking your place with, and they would all wink and nudge and know that you didn't belong, but they would play the game.
Sure.
And that's part of what my mother's story was, is that she went into the countryside. Her father brought her there. She and her
We'll start further back.
she and her brother split up and took the role of Christians in the countryside. Now, to rewind a little and bring you back to and I never will not claim to come anywhere near the detail that Ben was able to provide from my father's story.
I can help.
Yeah, and Ben certainly studied their whole experience to a greater degree, so he will be able to add more detail. But just to kind of give you an overview, my father always referred to my mother's story as Anne Frank with a happy ending, because in some ways they are similar. And of course, Anne Frank died in Bergen-Belsen of typhus only months before the liberation, and interestingly, but my mother survived. Conversely, Anne Frank's father survived, whereas my mom's parents did not. So they were captured. Abraham and Leah Rodriguez, my grandparents on my mother's side, maternal grandparents, were captured and killed in Auschwitz. And there was no real way to document that, but in 1960, oddly enough, the year we were born, my mother did receive documentation from the Red Cross that definitively stated that they had been killed there. So after that, there was no question. But certainly the evidence of their absence was certainly strong enough that my mother never encountered them after the war. But my mother, certainly 12 years younger than my father. So while my father was in his mid-20s, my mother was a young girl, prepubescent 12-year-old, roughly 9 to 12 during the war period. So you can understand how traumatic that would be. And her brother is 2 years older, I believe. Uncle Henry's 2 years older, year and a half older. So you can understand how challenging that would be for a young kid. You heard a lot of the history that goes that surrounded.
Yeah, we don't have to. Yeah,
about how the
same
Germans
thing was happening to my
mother. Right, how they
was
took.
happening to my father. The same thing was happening to my mother.
Right.
All the laws and the things that were going on for my wearing the Jewish star. That all you can fast forward through all that.
The political nature of occupation, and certainly of the early stages of the Holocaust. It had to be kind of implemented before they did the roundups.
But one thing I will say is that because my mother's family were more practicing Jews, it did have more of an impact on their lives.
Yeah, and certainly they were more prominently visible, so they would have to take more drastic steps to be safer.
Right.
And so Abraham, what he did is he went into hiding in 1942, and very similar to Anne Frank, they went into an office building of some sort, which is kind of like almost like a residence as well.
Pharmacy.
Okay, right.
Pharmacy.
But the residence is shared in that building, so the business is conducted on the main floor and the residence above, and so they were in an attic for how many months? 9 months.
9 months.
And what the thing that comes out of the story that I remember is certainly how difficult it would be for a young kid to basically not exist in this attic. Any movement could be detected by passersby and patrons of the pharmacy, so they had to really sit still during the business time period. And they'd have more movement, freedom of movement in the attic after business hours. So after 5, they might be able to move around, play, whatever that could be in an attic, maybe talk quietly. But from 8 to 5, they basically had to not exist. And so what that meant was they had to sit on the bed. They could not move from the bed during that time period. And so you can imagine how challenging that would be for kids, for a 13 and 11-year-old or roughly. And occasionally, and if you ever see the story of Anne Frank, you really get a good picture of what being in hiding in Amsterdam in 1942 was like in 1943, where the underground would bring information. They could get understand what's happening with the war and with relatives. Yeah, and and good things like cheese and bread might come their way. And the story, of course, of the cherries is always brings to mind a little humor.
Can I tell the story?
Well, I'll just it's just real quick where they came into a bag of cherries, and of course in the war it's a very very scarce commodity to have fresh fruit. So my mother and her brother sat there and basically killed off this entire bowl of cherries, and they got very sick. So they just live and learn through that process. And I remember hearing that. So, but eventually the address did become hot, and Abraham took Uncle Henry and put him somewhere else, and then took my mother to the countryside, where.
And he was in the countryside.
Okay.
They were about 10. It was really nice going back. We purposely went.
Yeah.
And
where they
went
were
to
hidden.
the towns to see geographically that how clever my grandfather was, because he during that time he did see them. He was in hiding somewhere, and he would come above water to make sure they had ration coupons, try to get food from them. So he put them about a good, maybe like 10 kilometers from each other. So Ellie's here, Henry's here. So I don't have to
Right.
go all over Holland to see my kids. Put them about 10 kilometers from each other. And the families were related too. Annie Ketel Bogaerts-Ketel for Uncle Henry, and Grietje Bogaerts for my mom. Sisters.
Okay. And so what my mother had to do was she had to take on the identity of a brand new person, a Christian person. And you can imagine, again, a woman, a small child who is studying to become an adult Jewess, a Jew, a practicing Jew, now has to learn an entire new identity, including her spirituality. She had to correctly answer questions regarding Christianity, or else her Judaism would become known. So she basically learned how to be a Christian under duress, not because she was choosing that, but certainly I think there was an influence ultimately in her decision. And of course, the role model in her decision was this woman who had hit her, a school teacher by the name of Grietje, which my father incorrectly translated as grace. And I think he did that for propaganda purposes, because as he would tell his story, he would talk about God's grace saving my mother. And but we like it, we stay with it. But really, Grietje is Margaret.
Margaret.
Yeah, but we go with it. And my oldest daughter's name is Grace, named after the woman who hid my mother. So so Grietje had to basically totally reschool my mother, Ellie, and she became Ellie Van Dyke, I understand.
No, Ventol.
Ventol, okay. Thank you. And so she had to revise her identity and go to Christian school and be ready to respond as a Christian.
Can I tell one story?
Yeah, sure,
though,
feel free.
It's because I've done a lot of interviews with family members. This story comes from my aunt. My mom Ellie was being schooled, and she had to start school, and she had to know who Jesus was. She had to know the Gospels. She had to know all these things. So the emphasis from Grietje was that. Okay, well, one time in Bible, in Bible class, Ellie Ventol was asked to stand up and read, okay? But the scripture at that time happened to be from Isaiah, not from the New Testament, okay? So the teacher says, Ellie, would you please stand up and read, from Isaiah, read the Bible verse for today or whatever it is. And my mom hadn't been taught these pronunciations. All she knew was her Jewish pronunciation of the prophets. So she stood up and said, I'm now going to read from, and in Hebrew, it's Yeshayahu. So she said in this Christian school, she stood up and she said, the passage for today is from Yeshayahu, whatever, I don't know what scripture it was, but she said Yeshayahu. Well, the teacher immediately heard that. I mean, why would you say Yeshayahu?
Gave it away, I guess.
Sure.
Yeah.
And went to Grietje, didn't say anything to my mom, because she's a little 12-year-old kid, she's not going to say anything to her, but went to Grietje and to the principal and said, we definitely have a Jewish girl in the class. There's no other way she could know that that's Yeshayahu, okay? So Grietje then goes to, the principal calls Grietje in, to Miss Bogaerts, and says to her, I know what you're doing. I know you're hiding a Jewish girl. There's, and does want her to say that. Yes, she wouldn't be any other thing but truthful. And then says, don't worry. The principal, have you heard this story? Says, don't worry. I am the head of the Dutch underground for the whole area, like maybe the province. I'm the head of the Dutch underground, so don't worry. Your secret's safe with me. He said to her, but not everybody else knows. You better help her with those Isaiah, Hosea,
right.
Better get some Old Testament in there because she's gonna be found out, know. And after that, every so often they'd find a sack of potatoes on their doorstep. They'd find a sack of beans after that from the Dutch underground.
So they got some help. But my mother did have to leave that area. I know they went to both of them hid in the north of Holland. They got hot again and had to go to the north of Holland and stay there for a certain amount of time. But eventually Holland was liberated and
but you certainly need to tell what happened to Mom when she had to flee. That's the crux of the story.
Oh, feel free.
You don't want to do it?
Well, I don't know what specifically.
Well, her spiritual decision to follow Jesus happened because she was very afraid. what happened was they had finally, much to everyone's dismay, caught the parents, Abraham and Leah Rodriguez.
Mm-hmm.
And when they caught the parents, the Dutch underground immediately let Miss Bogarts know that the parents had been caught, because Abraham Rodriguez had pictures of Henry and Ellie in his wallet, okay? And the Nazis would want to know, where are your kids? Who are these? Of course, they're your kids. They're
Where
pictures
are
of your
they?
kids. Where are they? And torture him. Where are your kids? So they had to leave. They had to leave where they were and go to actually, Mom went to Dromte, which is not in the north. It's Uncle Henry who went to Friesland. This is all stuff I got right for the book, is that my uncle had to go too. My uncle had to go to the north of Holland. Mom and Faricha had to hide in an attic for 6 weeks in a place called Dromte, which is more near the German border. And on the way to their new hiding place, my mom and Faricha are in a train car taking the train. And Mom's been hearing of who this Jesus person is for a good, 9 months now, I'd say. She's heard of this Jesus person. She has to live her life as a Christian, but she's scared to death because she doesn't know what's going to happen. And she's just heard, of course, that her parents have been caught, which she knows is an eventual death sentence for her parents. So in the train, about 5 green police are going through the train with the specific intention of finding Jews. Okay, this was, the green police, that was their intention. If you were Jewish and you saw the green police, you better be scared to death, because you knew they weren't the regular, you watch movies and you see them with their SS, the soldiers. They weren't the soldiers who were like just the soldiers. They're the ones, the green police, who are going to seek out Jews to be deported. And they come into her car, and they're asking for everybody's identification. Now, we don't have a picture of Mom, but she looked pretty Jewish. I mean, she didn't...
Mediterranean features, not Dutch, Aryan-looking, blonde hair, blue-eyed kind of thing, yeah.
What's Claudia Schiffer? Didn't look like Claudia Schiffer, okay? And so she's kind of scared, and they're asking for everybody's identification. And she really puts it to the test. She says, okay, I've heard about this Jesus person and that he's my Messiah and that he'll take care of me. And she prays. She says, Jesus, or I guess she called him Jesus because she didn't know Yeshua, but she said, if you really are who this person, she called her, I should call her stepmom or whoever.
My foster mother.
My foster, well, she didn't know that then because she didn't, we think of it as foster mother because that's afterwards. At that time, it was just this woman who I'm hiding with. If this person, if you really are who she's saying you are, the Messiah, okay, the Messiah of the Jewish people, and for that matter, if that's true and I'm Jewish and you've come to save me, okay, as my mom would say, put your money where your mouth is, okay, and save me right now from these Nazis. Okay, that's what she prayed in the train. And they came in, they looked at everybody, and they looked at Creaches. Okay, thank you very much. I had to take my mom's, Ellie Ventol. Thank you very much. Just left the train, never to be seen again. And after that, this feeling came over my mother that she just knew that prayer was answered because that's who Jesus was. Had to be. No question. So as now she's 13-year-old or 14-year-old, now she has made a decision to follow Jesus. And so for the rest of the time, from age 14 on till the end of the war, now it's not, you got to learn your Bible because you have to learn this because they're going to
quiz you on it,
and you got to know who this is. And now she wants to learn it. She wants to know who Jesus was. She wants to know the Sermon on the Mount. She wants to know why he was born in Bethlehem. And the Jewish part of it, the prophecies. Hey, she was beginning to kind of wonder too, who is this person? They're saying he's our Messiah. She went to her father one time, this is true, and said, who is this person they're talking about? Why have we never heard of him? And he said, well, that's for them, he said, Abraham. Learn it because you have to learn it to save your life. And then when we're all back together again, ha ha ha, that's what he thought. When we're all back together again after the war, you can forget about it. Just learn it for now. And, you know, and he even said it to Richa. He said to her, he was a willing participant. He said, do anything you have to do to save my daughter. And when Richa said, well, what if I have to teach her who Jesus is so that she fits into this school? She's going to be Ellie Van Tol. I can't keep her here in my house. So she's going to get found out that way. She's got to become a new person. He said, fine, I'll tell her.
Little did he know that not only was he helping to save her physical life, her temporal life, but also her spiritual life. Of course, but unfortunately, we don't know that he made that decision, for himself.
That is an awesome testimony. I'm going to just pause us
Sure.
here, gentlemen, because we have to change tape.
Okay.
Mark.
What was your mom's faith during the time of the Holocaust? I mean, you described that she, had to learn the New Testament in order to survive and so forth. But did she ever tell you that she, actually, felt? I mean, she still felt Jewish, and she had a faith in any sort of faith in God, and said the prayers or anything.
During the Holocaust?
Yeah, when she was hiding.
No, she couldn't have. Well, I shouldn't say she couldn't have. I don't know how much a Christian woman is going to know about Judaism. She might, she's living with now. That's the whole point. Is that yes, when they were together, I'm sure if you watch the Diary of Anne Frank, when they're all hiding together in their attic, how they would celebrate the Hanukkah. I'm sure for as long as they could, when everyone was hiding, that if there was a Hanukkah that came by, they were hiding, they would light the candles, and Passover, they would try to do what they could, and that kind of thing. I was wondering about that, getting matzah at that time. How are you going to do that during the war? But sure, when they were together. But then when she had to live with Richa Bogarts, no, she had to. That's the whole point. She had to forget about that, and until the war ended, become this new, this Christian girl. Okay. Now, after her, and I don't like using the word conversion, because you don't convert from anything. That's the whole point of what we're going to get to here, is that she quickly realized after her decision to become a follower of Jesus that was probably the most Jewish thing. I mean, it took a while to realize after studying prophecies and going to her, and a lot of that comes later. I gotta fast forward. A lot of that comes later when she's more grown up and after the war, when they've been liberated, that she sees that there are other Jewish people who survived, who made the same decision she did. Oh my gosh! Now there weren't that many, but there were. There were other Jewish people who made the same decision she did to follow Jesus, and could get together with them in this group called Hederech, which stands the Hebrew word for the way, and then start to realize, hey, and study prophecy and realize that following Jesus is probably the most Jewish thing you can do.
In fact, my parents met at a conference of Hebrew Christians after the war in 1948. So, they were like-minded in that respect, and met at that conference.
Right. Of Hederech.
Right.
Of Hederech.
So,
my father was a member of Hederech. My mother was a member. My father could never go. My father was studying to become a minister, and had his thesis and studies, and kind of like a what do you call that? A member, an emeritus or something. He's a member, but we never see him. We know he's there somewhere, honorary member, but we never see him because he's too busy. But my mom was totally, once the war was over.
She was active.
She was the secretary of Hederech. She went. They met on Saturdays. She was the secretary. She told her testimony. So that did later, after the war, when she could get back to her Jewish community and realize that some of them did become followers of Jesus, then, I'm sure she did want to get back to, celebrating her Jewish roots and that kind of thing. But that's a tough thing to do in war-torn Europe after the war, to try to mix those two together. And then on my mother's side, she did have the sad but true, what's the word, retribution of her family, which does happen. Because my Uncle Henry did not become a believer, and still to this day isn't, and we need to pray for him. And the rest of the family did, and she was the only one who did. So in the beginning after the war, there was much separation, rejection from that side of the family.
Interestingly, my Uncle Henry was 13, right in the middle of his war years.
So he couldn't be bar mitzvah.
Right, and later on in life, when he was 50, he went to Israel, I believe.
Yep,
he went to Israel to be bar mitzvah. And so this is a revival of his own faith. But unfortunately, it's not a faith in Jesus, but it certainly is a faith in, in the Jewish way, and I support him in that, and we praise God that he found God again. I think he may have had a very negative view of God, and I think many Jewish people who came out of the Holocaust, Elie Wiesel, he writes that for many Jews God died in the camps. And I think for some, in many ways, that was true for my uncle. But later in life, after he had his own family and was able to reestablish himself in the Jewish community, he became bar mitzvah again. So, in a sense, that was a rebirth for him. But my mother and her brother, my uncle, they were reconciled quite early on. When we were kids, they were always very amicable to each other. But there was always a dialogue about what the role of Jesus is in salvation, and where the Jews fit into that. I think they kind of came to a modus vivendi where my mother didn't have to continually try to convert my uncle. They just understood where and respected each other's viewpoints and loved each other in spite of the fact that they were different, But that's kind of where it ended when she died. So.
So your folks came together both as believers and were married.
Yes.
And so how were you raised with a Jewish identity? Were you bar mitzvah?
Yeah, but
Yes
not with all the trappings that modern Jewish bar mitzvahs have. Maybe we call it Jewish light. I think. So.
Jewish light.
So I would see it more as a confirmation. We never went to Hebrew school.
Right, we never went to Hebrew school.
Which, growing up in Baltimore County, which is a very Jewish area, and my peers all went to Hebrew school, was kind of a feeling of being left out of, what our friends were doing at that time, our Jewish friends. So that kind of set us apart a little bit, that they knew Hebrew, we didn't. Right. We knew as much Hebrew as was used by my parents in the service. Yeah. Which gave us a bit more than what our fellow Christians know, but certainly not as much as an active practicing Jew. Right. In a way, I regret that. I think that it would have been good to somehow get a more intense Jewish education. But it would have meant a greater commitment on our part. And heck, it's hard enough for kids to get a Christian education to understand the gospel. Right. And I think that's where our efforts were more directed when we were kids, which was to try to understand what the gospel was.
But we did have a fun, I think to this day, you and I both have a fundamental understanding of the Jewish cultural life, and Judaism,
and the meaning of the symbolism, the rituals,
the symbolism, and the things that Jewish people do in their religious life. We have we may not have, on the outside, we may not have, if you were a fly on the wall, you may not have, if you were a Jewish fly on the wall, you may have looked at us and said, not really Jewish. Yeah. But from a scriptural and a fundamental basis of how it all fits together, we got excellent, Bible-based teaching on what these things mean. And my brother and I do differ a little bit in how we express ourselves. I've gone into Messianic Judaism, pretty much.
I'm a Presbyterian.
And my brother is a Presbyterian. Okay, but I'm sure you could ask my brother, what does Passover mean in the light of belief in Jesus? What does Hanukkah, what does Passover, what does Yom Kippur mean? What do they mean? What is their significance? And he would be able to answer you from our upbringing and what we went, how we were raised. He would be able to answer you.
And these points are vitally
would.
important to me also because while I could never hope to instill the intense Judaism, what it really means to be Jewish in my kids, my children, I want them to know that. I want them to be aware of what their heritage is and what the symbolism and the ritual is, from whence Jesus came, and and to understand what his community was when he was walking the earth. So I think they get a little bit of a different perspective than their peers in the Presbyterian Church. They're coming from something of a Jewish background, but again, it's not as intense as I would like it to be.
What would you say to a Jewish person who, knowing that you're believers in Jesus and your parents were believers in Jesus, if they were to say that believing in Jesus and being Jewish in light of the Holocaust means that you've turned your back on the 6 million?
And Ben's kind of addressed that in that accepting Christ and taking on the commandments of Christ is really the most Jewish thing you can do. In a way, you've completed the Judaism that you've started out with. It's a completion. The New Testament is a fulfillment of the Old. It's not a violation. They're complementary. So I don't see it as, certainly not as a turning of our back on the 6 million. In fact, in a way, what's very hard to communicate to our fellow Jews is that Jesus died for them, and so we, in essence, we honor them by recognizing the Messiah of the people that they belong to. So, but I realize that that's very hard to get across as a message, and I think there's a certain antipathy within the Jewish community itself to recognizing Christ as the Messiah. It's almost as though it's become standard procedure to reject Christ and not to look at the evidence, the spiritual evidence that comes through in the fulfillment of the prophecies. So I think that's unfortunate.
Can I interject
Yep.
a little bit? The first thing that I want to say, just on the general subject of belief in Jesus or Yeshua as a Messiah, is in the world there's of course what man does and what man wants to do. We're sinful man, every one of us. And then there's God, humans,
yeah.
right? And then there's God and what God has laid out. Okay? I know it's hard because, I've heard my Uncle Henry say it for many years. Well, where was God, okay, during the Holocaust? Okay? Well, he was there, okay? You may not think he was there.
God was crying too.
God was crying too. But if you look at, I guess the fundamental thing is, if you look at the stories of people like my mom and my dad, individuals like that, you have to see that God was there, okay? So then if you've come to realize that through something like that, now apply it to your own life and don't look at what man says, okay? Yes, it might be your father, your mother, your brother, whoever, but don't look at what they say. You may love them, but look at what God says. And the only place to look at what God says is the Scriptures, okay? You have to be able to look at the Old Testament, or what I call the older covenant, okay? And then you have to look at the newer covenant, and you have to put them together. And that's what God has set out, is the Scriptures. All of it together. The Torah, the Tanakh, the prophets, the writings, and then the story of Jesus' life in the Gospels. All those things come together. And look at what they say, and I know it's tough, but look at what they say and really investigate it for yourself to see what that says, as opposed to what man says.
Also, it's a virtual impossibility to assess what role God played in the experiences of every survivor
Right.
and victim in the Holocaust.
Right.
I think we have to take a step back from it, and just kind of make an assessment that the Holocaust was completely of human doing. There's nothing of God in that,
Right.
other than how God made himself known individually in those stories, like the ones of my father and my
Right.
mother and Corrie ten Boom
Right.
and the thousands of others. And you go to the Holocaust Museum, you can see a big white wall of all the names of the righteous Gentiles that helped hide Jews and you know, who lived their Christianity, and they were living testaments to God's role in preventing the evils that the Holocaust stands for. But the Holocaust is a human thing.
Right.
And
And then the other thing, which I want to interject, is that look after the Holocaust, historically, what amazing prophecy was fulfilled out of that, which is the nation of the State of Israel. The State of Israel, God took a horrible thing, which was the killing of 6 million Jews, and yes, you can debate this all you want. Why did it happen? Why did he let it happen? But he took that, okay, and God takes evil and he uses it for good, okay? Satan is probably who was involved in the engineering of the Holocaust. And we could get into a big philosophical discussion about that, but I don't want to. But the bottom line is, look at the Holocaust and then look at what God did out of that, okay, which was the founding, after 1,900 years, a nation that no one ever thought would ever be on the face of the earth again is now there for Jewish people to go back to. And that's a fulfillment of prophecy. So look at what God does. He takes evil and he uses it for good. He takes evil and he uses it for good by saving my parents. He takes evil and he uses it for good by creating the nation of Israel as a homeland for Holocaust survivors who need to go back there.
Now tell me a little bit about the book and the website. Your dad was, involved in chronicling his own story.
Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about that and how it got published and so forth, and why he wanted it done?
Well, from 1968 on, my parents were very much in the limelight in the greater Baltimore area, wouldn't you say? And they did that on purpose because that was their role, to get as many Jewish people in the greater Baltimore area to hear about Jesus. And they were ministers of what you'd now call a Messianic Jewish congregation. But back then, Messianic Judaism hadn't really bloomed into what it is today. So back then, it was called Hebrew Christianity, and the congregation was a mission of the Presbyterian Church. And we always joke about this because of how long the name of our little group was. Emmanuel, Hebrew Christian Presbyterian Congregation.
That's a mouthful.
Emmanuel Hebrew Christian Presbyterian Congregation. So from 1968 on, they were there, and I think by 1974, my father had told his story so much that it was probably getting to the point where people said, you need to write that down, I mean, we want, can we read something about that? And he might have a tract here or a tractor. He might have something.
I wonder if he was thinking about his posterity, too, because
Yeah.
maybe then he wasn't thinking, one day I'm not going to be
Memoirs.
here to
Right.
tell this when
Right.
it needs to be written.
Right.
Yeah.
So in 1974, and well, before that, I'm sure he started before that. I remember him. The way he did it was, there was no computers back then. I don't think my father would have gotten on one even if he did have them.
He was a big typist, though. He was big into
but I
typewriters.
remember the way he did it. I remember he had a dictaphone, and that's the way a lot of people write a book when they've never done one. Is they take a dictaphone and they talk into it, and then they type it out and edit it and that kind of thing. And he had a ghostwriter, Constance Faith Goddard, who really was more like an editor, who did help him put it all together and that kind of thing. So the Last Jew of Rotterdam, which is he kind of coined. I mean, according to him, they really, I guess the way I look at it is, in the prison, the way his story goes, they really did refer to him something like that. They would always refer to him, the Nazis, because he was the only Jew. It kind of like he got that coin, that last Jew over there, Ernie, hey, that last Jew, their letzte Jude. You got the 10 over here, and then you got that Jew, that last Jew over there. So he kind of, I think what happened was the publisher said, now, Reverend Cassutto, we really need a catchy title for your book. Can you, just think of something from your experiences that would really be a catchy title. I mean, clearly he's not the last Jew in the city of Rotterdam. I'm sure there were other Jews there, but he was the last Jew in the prison. So, and they kept calling him that last Jew were there. So he kind of coined it, you know, the last Jew of Rotterdam, and that's what the book was titled. And you know, so it came out in 1974, and we have it over there. But it was a little paperback. I mean, $1.25.
It's almost like a big tract. It's
right. It's a little
almost like a thick tract of
right.
you know what he experienced and what
Right.
his viewpoint was. And it didn't just talk about his Holocaust experiences.
Right.
It also talked about
After that.
his spiritual challenges that
Right.
came certainly as a result of that, and he had some physical and emotional concerns that he needed a savior to help him through those, and that's what he talks about in the latter part of the book. In fact, we even mentioned our birth is even mentioned
our
at the
birth is
end.
mentioned in
So
it.
it's really a biography
It's a
of
biography
his
life.
his experience. Yeah.
And what kind of feedback did he get, or do you guys get?
Well, I will say, when he was alive and what was happening then, certainly he was. My father and his mission, I think, he's caught between a rock and a hard place, and he got the worst of both worlds because as a Jew, he was not really accepted into the Christian community, and he was seen as somebody different, apart,
Right.
maybe even eccentric, and certainly my dad had his eccentricities. And then from the Jewish standpoint, he was not really Jewish. He's a Christian, you know, just posing.
wolf
He's
in
just
sheep's
trying,
clothing.
yeah, he's just trying to convert us. So he never was really fully accepted into either religious community because he stood for something that was really quite unusual and quite unique at that point.
But I must say, in the Christian circles, I think his book got a limited but enthusiastic response.
Yeah,
In other words, people who I talked to, or you know, people who we heard from back then, you know, I really enjoyed the book, getting it all down, reading the story, you know, reading about your mom and your dad.
My mom's story is also told in
and
the
told
book,
in
yeah.
there to a small degree, and, you know, and that kind of thing. It's good to have it down. It's
Yeah.
just it's even 25 years later. It's good to have it down.
Now, unfortunately, the book's out of print,
Print,
and it would take an order of 10,000 books to
right.
to get it back on the
Right. Plus,
you know, on the
I
stands.
really think in today's market, if you took what that is and tried to sell it today, it's a little.
It's not sensational enough to carry weight.
Well, not
in
just
the-
that. The amount of
Yeah.
information. It's.
Yeah.
You know, people want. We're in the information era. People want information.
yeah.
They don't want one little page here, and now you're going on. You know, what about
Right.
this? What
Give us
about
the
that?
details. So that leads us to where has the story gone in the information age? Well, because I became a teacher of social studies, I taught for 8 years over in Hagerstown, Maryland, at North Hagerstown High School. And in 1994, I got involved somehow with computers and with the internet, and started to build a website for the school. And as we developed different units of study in my area of social studies, and my area of expertise is the Holocaust, I felt like, hey, wouldn't it be interesting for my students to have access to my parents' story, and certainly for the whole world, because the World Wide Web gives access to everyone globally. So I developed a rudimentary page based on the historical sections of the Holocaust experience. And the reason why I had to be very careful and couldn't get into the spiritual side of it was because this was on the school's website. So it's a public school, and we maintain a separation of church and state. So I was pretty good about doing that. But on my own account, my own America Online account for my family, I actually delivered a sermon to my church called My Miracle,
which is great.
And so I took the story and all the perspectives that we've talked about, the spiritual perspectives, and commented on their experiences from a spiritual viewpoint. So linked to the secular version is the spiritual version, which is essentially the sermon I delivered in 1998. And the website's gone through just maybe
Lots of changes.
one major facelift to kind of, as I've built up my web design skills, try to make it a little bit more accessible and pleasing to the eye. But certainly the information has remained the same, and I've made a point to pretty much focus in on the Holocaust experiences. And so you can do a search now for Cassutto, and one of the most linked to aspects of everything of my online presence is the Cassutto Memorial Pages, which is really what the title of the website is. And certainly I hope that when Ben is done revising and improving the book to develop...
Oh, I am done.
And when it hits the
Well,
stands,
maybe I'm not done. I don't know.
we can certainly link. I certainly wouldn't want to put his entire content online because it would defeat the purpose of buying it.
Right.
But certainly we can link
Chapters.
online content
Right.
with his book so that people have an idea of how the site is improved and how the book's improved and how additional information has come to light and the research that he's done. So we want to make that
Right.
that
But I
known.
have to give credit where credit is due, because much of the research that I've done to do a rewrite of this book, and I'll get into how that all came about, comes from George's webpage. I mean, I wasn't able to do my rewrite if I didn't have links. Your wonderful link section and your Holocaust. I mean, his links to all these different
Yeah,
web
to do the
pages
historical background, yeah.
and just having a computer on my own to do the historical background. Links to I think Ellen Land Weber's site, wonderful site on stories of Jewish rescuers, who chronicles the people who hid my mom and my uncle. Just those things that I couldn't have gotten to. I mean, certainly I had to purchase my own computer, which I finally did, but without your website,
Yeah.
I couldn't have gotten to them in order to incorporate them into a more expanded version of the Last Jew in Rotterdam.
And what a great, the internet certainly
it's
is
unbelievable.
is symbolic of all the good and bad things that people do, but it's a sort of reflection of our own activity. But
Right.
what a great tool it has been
it's
to
unbelievable.
put my parents' experiences on the web. It's available for anyone in the world to access. And I get email, from time to time that says, what a great way to share what they've done. I cried when I read it. No one's actually said to me, I've come to Christ from your website, but certainly I think it has that impact. It has, there's a certain, impact that it has on people who read it. And also the fact that when I developed the site back in '94, part of what sparked this was that my oldest sister, had a big old box of essentially what I call archival photographs. Now, unfortunately, there's no photograph of my parents during the Holocaust years, but there are some photographs that come pretty close, about 1949, right
also
as
true,
they...
you have Uncle Henry and Mom, that passport photo.
Yeah, they're all from the
That's-
years directly after.
Right.
But that's as close as we come to seeing what they look like. And so the website really does capture them. Of course, they're deceased now, so there's no way to see what they looked like either then or contemporaneously when they were adults. And so it's kind of caught now, and that's
Once
that's
again,
nuts.
for posterity.
And it's great, if more pictures come to light and more information. The beauty of the web is that it's changeable. You can add it and you can improve it. So, so I think it's a great witness, both the My Miracle page and the secular version to, so for people to learn from. And when you go to Holocaust remembrance sites and Holocaust education sites, you'll probably find a link to it, and that's neat. That's neat to know. So.
But then, I kind of got, took the ball rolling myself also in a decision to really rewrite my father's book. A lot of that came from just looking at my brother's web pages and his links to things and seeing that, because there was no information highway in 1974, a lot of things got left out. A lot of things got kind of, weren't really there that I feel from a historical standpoint.
Overlooked.
Things that were overlooked or things that I actually thought were wrong. God loved my father, but things that were wrong historically, that if you did put the book out again with all this information that's out there, people saying, no, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. You know what I mean? But then also from a more of a witnessing standpoint and a spiritual standpoint, moving back to Baltimore, which I did in 1989, and I went for a while to a Presbyterian church, and that was the same church that we were friends with when we grew up, and just being in those circles and people coming to me and saying, "You're Ernest Cassutto's son, aren't you?" And I'd say, "Yes." And they'd say, "Didn't he write that book? That book, The Last Jew of Rotterdam. He wrote a book, right? He's in the Holocaust. Yeah. How can I get a copy of that?" And I'd have to continually say,
I want to add to that, though. It's kind of interesting because I don't want to plug anybody. I listen to NPR, and NPR, one of NPR's sponsors is a website called 21 North Main, and so it is a reseller of out-of-print and antiquarian books. So I got on the web and checked it out, and yes, they were able to get me a copy of my dad's book. So interestingly enough, my copy seems to have gone the way of all flesh somewhere. Unfortunately, it was signed, so I don't know where it is. But I said I need to have a copy of this, and I want to, give 21 North Main some business. So I ordered it on the web, and I have it upstairs now. So that is really a blessing to know that it's still around.
Yeah. But not in the way that I'd like to, I'd like to have it. In other words, my vision is so that you could go into a bookstore and, and buy this, this story, even if it's under Jewish studies or Holocaust studies, or if it has to be in the Christian section because they don't want it in the Jewish section.
Yeah, it's kind of like an orphan
Christian section.
Yeah, right.
But I have gotten a lot of people over the last 5 to 10 years who would say, how can I get a copy of your dad's book? I don't have it. I read it. I don't know what happened to it, just like you're saying. And I'd have to say, well, I'm really sorry, but you can try the bookstores or whatever, but it's out of print. It's not like I can sell you a copy. It's not like we have a box of them sitting here at my sister's and I can sell you a copy. I can't do that. And I called Whitaker House, with the publisher, Whitaker House, who published it, and they're like, well, these days we'd have to do about 5,000, and even if it was $2 each or $3 each, you're looking 5,000 times 2, that's $10,000, okay? Ran it by my family, well, $10,000, we don't really have $10,000. People are, so the thought occurred to me, and I guess the last straw is when I went to my first Messianic Jewish conference in 1997, and I'm sitting there registering for my room at this Messianic Jewish conference, the first one I'd ever been to, and even registering for my room, the guy who's taking my money says, Cassutto, I'm like,
that book.
Your dad, I read your dad's book 25 years ago, but I don't have a copy of it. How can I? I'm like, well, this is the straw that breaks the camel's back. I just have to sit down and do the research, which involved a month trip to the Netherlands recently to kind of nail some of these things down. The research from my brother's amazing website and other things that I've done, interviews with family members, my Uncle Henry, who's still alive, to just expand it and, make it something that today's reader, I hope, will want to read. Mm-hmm.
Well, gentlemen, that's actually all the questions I have, but I want to give you an opportunity too. I mean, this video is going to be viewed by, unsaved Jewish and Gentile people.
It's my wife, Teresa.
Is there anything though that you would want to add? Just knowing that unsaved people will look at this and hopefully consider Yeshua.
Yeah, I guess I have to kind of respond a little bit and maybe speak from the heart, and that having grown up in an atmosphere of dialogue between Christians and Jews, and I know there's a lot of sensitivity where approaching Jewish people is concerned. I know there was a recent controversy about Baptists and how the Baptist Church felt that it was their mission to convert Jewish people, and how Jewish people really reacted very negatively. And so it seems like there has to be a way to reach out to Jews without alienating them. And it's a very challenging thing, because if you go with the direct approach, you're going to lose them, and we're going to lose that light.
We just lost. Oh, we just lost an age.
So.
Okay. George. I'm a little concerned about that upstairs. Can you hear that?
Very hard for Jewish people.
Yeah.
But I don't know if we want to get into that or not.
It's a big philosophy thing there. Okay. Tell me when you're ready.
George, whenever.
Okay.
Go ahead. And
Okay. Just to kind of bring closure to my comment, and that is that I cannot dictate to any Christian or Hebrew Christian how they want to approach Jewish people, but what I think my father's certainly he had the direct approach because he had he had a pulpit from which to speak, but I like to emulate Christ. I like to live as much of the Christ-like life as I can. And I think when Jewish people say, where's that spirit you got coming from? That's my door. That's when I open up and say, and open up the door. And I think the Spirit moves people, Jewish people especially, when they see that, to want to inquire what's going on. How do you have that joy in your life? Mm-hmm. And then the door is open. But I think it's a very difficult tightrope to walk when you're talking about how do we approach Jewish people to believe in Jesus. It's really hard. Yeah. Okay, Ben.
Well, I totally agree with my brother. One of the first books I ever read, when I always say this, getting back into, I never left Messianic Judaism, or I never left Judaism or being a Jew who believes in Jesus, or Yeshua, as Messianic Jews call him. But I also, when I came back to Baltimore, because we grew up with Presbyterianism, with Presbyterian domination. I was in a Presbyterian church for a while, and then gravitated back to my Jewish roots as time went on in the Presbyterian church. And I guess where my perspective is that when my parents were growing up, okay, or when they became believers in Jesus, it was extremely hard as a Jewish person to have an identity, along with what my brother's saying, with not wanting to alienate. Of course, you don't want to alienate Jewish people. And so I read this book when I first became a believer called, I always get the title wrong, I'll Bring the Bagels, You Bring the Bagels, I'll Bring the Gospel, by Barry Rubin, okay? And it talked about that very thing, okay, that you have to understand where, it was written for Christians, but you have to understand where Jewish people are coming from in this whole mix. You have to understand who you are. You have to understand who they are. You have to understand what they've been exposed to in their lives, okay? And his whole book is about not alienating them, okay? How to share this information with them, and not just information, but what your beliefs are without alienating them. So I totally agree with what my brother's saying, okay? The only thing I want to add to that is that there has been, in the past 15 to 20 years, this move so that if you are a Jewish person, you don't have to lose your Jewish identity. That was the biggest struggle, I think, for my parents. And a credit to them, they did it as best they could. But you did have to struggle with, okay, how am I going to believe in this person named Jesus as the Messiah, okay? But also remain true to my Jewish heritage, okay? 50 years ago, you couldn't do that too well, okay? You could do it in your home. You could, but you couldn't, there's no place you could meet, okay, with other people who had the same beliefs as you, but still want to embrace your Jewish roots. Today you can do that. That's what I want to share, along with not alienating them. Say, look, you don't have to give up anything. Anything. You don't have to give up anything in Judaism. Nothing. Not today you don't. Okay? But you can still have this belief in Yeshua or Jesus as the Messiah. You can do it.
And all the benefits that come from that.
Come from that. From having the Holy Spirit in your life, from leading really all the Torah is the Torah is really the law. And Jesus didn't come to abolish the Torah. He is the Torah, okay? So you don't have to give any of that up. You don't have to, okay? And that's what I really hope and pray that Jewish people would understand. You don't have to have this struggle. And believe me, it's a struggle. And it comes right back to the alienation. You're going to feel alienated. How am I going to do this? You want me to do this. How am I going to do it? I can't do it. I just can't do it. Don't talk to me about it anymore. I just can't do it. Well, I just want to share with him, you can't.
It's like Tevye, there is no other hand.
Yeah,
I can't.
Yeah, well, there is another hand, right? There
yeah,
is.
yeah.
You just, I don't want to alienate either, but just let people know, it is possible. It's doable. In today's day and age, it is doable. Would you agree?
Yes. Good.
Oh, go back to that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's a manual.
And
You
you,
see
can
the-
see a Jewish star.
just both looking.
Yeah,
You can see the Jewish star and the cross.
Maybe just point to the Spanish. Yeah.
Yeah.
How old was he
See
there?
the Hebrew writing. Here's the Ark of the Covenant here.
1968.
Did your mom stay in touch with Krisha?
Oh, sure. That's a picture. Go to that picture. She came over and stayed with us for what, about a year? No, go back to that picture up there with the. There's Screecha. There's Dad. There's my dad. There's Screecha. Had come over from Holland to America. There's my mom in Passaic.
It's
And
before we were born.
before we were born. So that's Marilyn, Hetty, and Carolyn. My three are sisters.
Let's see if I can zoom in, but I can't.
Okay. You guys have.
Should have Venti at this time. Isn't there one more kid?
Try again.
Here, I can hang on to it, Ben.
Alright, man. Okay, ready? Turn around. Okay, ready? Give me a good whack. Go. Good hit.
Wow.
Good tree shot. You try again. Here comes up. Give it a whack. Strike two. Try again. Is he coming back? Sounds like he's coming back. Okay, here we go. Now! Whoa! Another tree shot. Why don't we stand over there so we don't keep hitting in the tree?
Why do I keep getting in the bin?
Here you go.
Uncle Ben, can you throw the frisbee to Gracie?
Now you're about to give me a good whack.
She's really
Ready?
good.
Stand like you. There you go. Ready? Here it comes. Now! Yeah! Here it comes. Ready? Whoa. Ground ball.
First base.
Yeah, boy!
That's a good one, Daddy. Good one, Daddy.
Am I just kicking
Yeah,
out?
the idea is throw them out there. Somebody's grabbing it.
Oh, this is good. This is like for an interesting.
Good
The
catch.
Cassutto brothers live in Baltimore. Okay.
Ew, yuck, that was a bad one. But you can run to the base. If you kick it.
Okay, coming at you. Ow.
Chop trace off at the legs.
What about me?
I'm sorry, honey.
Yeah, kick it.
Okay, step back a little bit. Whenever you're.
Yeah, I'm really hungry. There you go.
Okay, thanks, honey.
Come on.
Well,
This is going to be great, you know?
I know.
I'm
I
starving.
feel like I'm back in.
Okay. Okay.
No, I'm starving. Wow, this is great. Aren't you hungry?
All right,
Come on. Let's go. Time to go.
Munchkin's good.
Well, I need.
All right, we're try again. Ready?
Yeah, whenever you're ready. Okay.
Okay.
That's pretty good. Yeah, go the other way. All right, I'll follow you.
Whenever you're ready. Okay, come on out.
Think about Rita's. Way to go.
Yeah.
Give hand down. There you go.
I'm a doctor. I'm a doctor. I'm a doctor.
All right.
Okay.